Welcome back. If you are watching this, you are probably lying in bed or sitting somewhere very quiet, trying to slow your mind down. That is exactly what this video is for. Today, we are going to travel back thousands of years, all the way to the ancient world, and we are going to spend time, quiet, unhurried time, inside the schools of civilizations that no longer exist. We will look at how children learned in ancient Mesopotamia, in ancient Egypt, in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, and in ancient China. We will compare them slowly. There is no rush. Let the images settle in your mind like dust in still water. Before we talk about ancient schools, let us first think about something simple. What is a school? A school is a place or a system where knowledge is passed from one generation to the next. That is all it is. A teacher knows something. A student does not yet know it. The teacher gives it. The student receives it. This has been happening for as long as human civilization has existed. The word school actually comes from the ancient Greek word skole, which meant leisure or free time. The Greeks believed that learning was something you did when you were free from labor. Only people with free time could afford to think, to question, to study. That idea alone tells you something important about ancient education. It was not for everyone. It was for the few. In most ancient civilizations, school was not a right, it was a privilege. If you were born into a farming family, you learned to farm. If you were born into a merchant's family, you learned to trade. Only the children of priests, scribes, nobles, and royalty entered formal schools. The idea of education for all people, for every child in every village, that idea came much, much later in history. So, let us now walk through these ancient classrooms one by one, slowly, like we have all the time in the world. We begin in Mesopotamia. This is the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now modern Iraq. This civilization, built by the Sumerians and later the Babylonians and Assyrians, gave the world one of its earliest gifts, writing. And with writing came the need for schools. In ancient Mesopotamia, the school was called the Edubba. That word means tablet house. The name tells you almost everything. The school was a house where students worked with clay tablets. Students, almost always boys, would sit with a small wet clay tablet in their hand and a reed stylus, a sharp-pointed tool, and they would press marks into the clay to form the wedge-shaped script known as cuneiform. The school day was long. Students arrived in the morning and stayed until evening. There were no summer vacations, no winter breaks as we know them today. The curriculum was strict. Students copied lists. They copied lists of words, lists of names, lists of animals, lists of plants, lists of professions. Over and over again, they pressed the same marks into clay, learning the shapes of thousands of symbols by pure repetition. The teacher was called the ummiyah, meaning expert or master. The teacher's assistant was called the big brother, and it was this big brother who often watched over students during the day. Discipline was physical. Clay tablets have been found with descriptions of students being caned for being late, for being absent, for talking in class, for not writing neatly. One tablet, discovered by archaeologists and now thousands of years old, actually contains a student's own words, a story about a boy complaining about school. He describes being hit by the teacher for his writing, being scolded for his posture, being reprimanded for wandering through the streets instead of studying. It reads like something a child today might whisper to a friend. Some things, it seems, do not change. The graduates of the Edubba became scribes, one of the most respected and well-paid professions in ancient Mesopotamia. A scribe could work for the palace, the temple, or wealthy merchants. Literacy was power, and the Edubba was the gate to that power.
Now let us move west, across the desert, to the land of the Nile, ancient Egypt. Here, too, education was tied deeply to writing. The Egyptians used hieroglyphs, those beautiful picture symbols carved into stone and painted on walls. But for everyday writing, they used a simpler script called hieratic, written with reed brushes on papyrus, a kind of paper made from the papyrus plant that grew along the Nile. Schools in ancient Egypt were called houses of instruction. They existed in two main places, attached to temples or within the royal palace. The temple schools trained boys to become priests. The palace schools trained boys to become officials, administrators, soldiers, and diplomats. A student in ancient Egypt would begin school around the age of 7 or 8. He would sit cross-legged on the floor. There were rarely desks or chairs, and he would practice writing on broken pieces of pottery or limestone called ostraka, because papyrus was expensive and not wasted on beginners. Only when a student had learned enough would he be allowed to write on real papyrus. The Egyptian curriculum was deeply moral and philosophical. Students did not only learn writing and arithmetic, they studied what were called wisdom texts, collections of advice, ethics, and observations about life written by ancient sages. One famous wisdom text, called the Instructions of Amenemhat, taught students how to behave in the presence of powerful men, how to speak carefully, how to live a life of discipline and virtue. Education in Egypt was deeply tied to the concept of ma'at, the idea of truth, balance, and cosmic order. A well-educated Egyptian was not simply a person who could read and write. He was a person who understood his place in the universe and could maintain harmony around him. Now we cross the Mediterranean Sea to ancient Greece, and here something dramatic changes. For the first time in our journey, we encounter an idea that feels almost modern. The idea that education should develop the whole person, not just the mind, but the body, not just the technical skill, but the character, the soul. The ancient Greeks divided education into two great tracks. The first was gymnastics, physical training for the body. The second was musiki, music, poetry, and intellectual culture for the soul. These were considered inseparable. A Greek boy who was physically trained but intellectually empty was considered as incomplete as a boy who was clever but physically weak. Boys in ancient Greece began their education around age 7 or 8. They were sent to a teacher called a grammatistes to learn reading and writing, to a kitharistes to learn music and poetry, and to a paidotribes to learn athletics at a facility called a gymnasium. These were not all in the same building. Education in Greece was distributed, different teachers, different places, different days. At around age 12, boys entered a more advanced stage of education. In Athens, the most intellectually celebrated city of ancient Greece, boys studied rhetoric, the art of speaking well. They studied philosophy, the love of wisdom. They studied logic, mathematics, and astronomy. The Athenian ideal was a citizen who could argue clearly, think deeply, and participate fully in the life of the city. It is important to note that Greek education was exclusively for free-born males. Women were largely excluded from formal education. Slaves were excluded entirely. This is one of the great contradictions of ancient Greek civilization. The people who invented democracy and philosophy denied both to the majority of people living in their own cities. But let us dwell on one extraordinary figure who changed Greek education forever: Socrates. Socrates did not have a school building. He did not stand at a podium and lecture. He walked through the marketplace, the agora, and asked questions.
He asked merchants, soldiers, politicians, and craftsmen. He asked them to define things like justice, beauty, and courage. When they gave answers, he gently showed them that their answers were incomplete. This method, asking questions to lead someone toward deeper understanding, became known as the Socratic method, and it is still used in classrooms and law schools today. After Socrates came Plato, who established the academy, perhaps the first true institution of higher learning in the Western world. And after Plato came Aristotle, who established the Lyceum, where he famously walked and talked with his students as he taught them. Greek philosophy was not learned sitting still. It was learned in motion, in conversation, in argument, in the open air.
From Greece, let us move to Rome. The Romans admired the Greeks enormously. They borrowed their gods, their art, their architecture, and much of their educational philosophy. But the Romans transformed Greek education into something more practical, more militaristic, more Roman. In the earliest period of Rome, education was entirely the responsibility of the family. A Roman father, the pater familias, was the ultimate authority. He taught his sons how to farm, how to fight, how to speak, and how to behave as Roman citizens. The mother taught daughters how to manage a household. This was education without classrooms, without teachers, without any institution at all. As Rome grew into an empire, schools appeared. The first level was called the Ludus, where a teacher called a literator taught children reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Students would bring their own wax tablets and styluses. They sat on hard wooden benches or sometimes simply on the floor. Classes were often held outdoors under the open sky in a shaded portico. The second level was the Grammaticus, a school focused on reading great literature, especially poetry, history, and rhetoric. The third and highest level was the school of the Rhetor, where young men learned the art of public speaking. In Rome, a man who could speak powerfully in the Senate or in court was a man with real political power. Rhetoric was not a decoration, it was a weapon. Compared to Greek education, Roman education was less philosophical and more pragmatic. Romans were builders, lawyers, soldiers, and administrators. Their schools reflected those values. A Roman student memorized the 12 tables, the ancient laws of Rome, as early as childhood. He learned to argue, to persuade, to command. The goal was not wisdom in the abstract Greek sense. The goal was competence and authority. One fascinating difference from the earlier civilizations we've discussed, by the time of the Roman Empire, schools had become far more accessible. Wealthy families hired private tutors, often educated Greek slaves, to teach their children at home. But there were also public schools in towns and cities across the empire. While still not available to the poor or to slaves, education had spread from the palace and the temple into the urban fabric of everyday Roman life. Now we travel far to the east, to ancient China. Here, the story of education is inseparable from one name, Confucius. Confucius was a philosopher who lived in China around 500 BCE, roughly the same time as Socrates in Greece. Like Socrates, he gathered students around him. Unlike Socrates, he wrote extensively, or rather his students recorded his teachings, and those teachings became the foundation of Chinese education for more than 2,000 years. The central idea of Confucian education was self-cultivation. The goal of learning was not to gain a technical skill, it was to become a better person, a junzi, which means a gentleman, a person of moral excellence and social grace. The Confucian student studied the 6 arts: ritual, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. But more than skills, he studied ethics, loyalty, filial piety, respect for one's parents and ancestors, and the proper way to behave in society. A remarkable feature of ancient Chinese education, one that set it apart from every civilization we have discussed, was the creation of the imperial examination system during the Han Dynasty around 200 BCE. This system allowed any man, regardless of birth, regardless of wealth, to take a standardized examination. If he passed, he could become a government official. If he failed, he could study and try again. This was a revolutionary idea that merit, not birth, should determine who holds power. In practice, the system favored those wealthy enough to afford years of study, but the ideal it represented, that intelligence and hard work could overcome the circumstances of birth, was genuinely radical for its time. Compared to Greece and Rome, where political power was almost entirely hereditary and restricted by social class, ancient China was testing something that looked like meritocracy thousands of years before the modern world.
Now let us breathe. Let us hold all 5 civilizations in our mind at once and look at what they shared and where they diverged. In every civilization we have discussed, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, education was primarily for boys. Women were largely excluded from formal schooling in all 5 cultures. This is perhaps the most striking similarity across all of them, separated as they were by thousands of miles and thousands of years. In every civilization, writing was at the heart of education. Whether it was cuneiform on clay, hieroglyphs on papyrus, Greek letters on wax tablets, Latin on parchment, or Chinese characters on silk and bamboo, literacy was the defining mark of an educated person. To read and write was to be someone. To be illiterate was to be invisible to history. Physical punishment was common in most ancient schools. Mesopotamian clay tablets record it. Egyptian papyri describe it. Roman writers complained about it. Learning in the ancient world was often enforced by fear. But here is where they began to differ. Mesopotamia and Egypt trained scribes, specialists in recording information for the state. Their schools were bureaucratic institutions producing functional servants of power. Greece, by contrast, trained citizens, people who would participate in public life, argue in courts and assemblies, and engage with ideas philosophically. Rome trained orators and administrators, people who would run an empire. China trained moral individuals and civil servants, people who would embody virtue and govern wisely. The Greek model was the most intellectually free. Students were encouraged to question everything, to challenge their teachers, to form their own conclusions. The Chinese model was the most structured and text-based. Mastery of a fixed canon of sacred texts was the highest achievement. The Roman model was the most practical, rhetoric and law above all else. The Egyptian model was the most spiritual, education as a form of aligning oneself with the divine order of the universe. And now we have arrived at the end of our journey. We have traveled from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the Nile Delta, across the Aegean Sea to Athens, through the streets of Rome, and all the way to the ancient courts of China. In every one of those places, a child sat somewhere, on a stone floor, on a wooden bench, in an open courtyard, beside a river, holding something in their hands, trying to learn. A lump of wet clay, a papyrus scroll, a wax tablet, a brush dipped in ink. The object changed, the child did not. Every child who ever sat in a school, in any civilization, in any century, was doing the same thing. They were trying to understand the world well enough to live in it. They were receiving something that had been carried forward by thousands of hands before them. And when they grew up, if things went well, they would carry it a little further. That is what a school is at its essential. Not a building, not a system. just a chain of human beings passing something forward through time. You have now traveled 20 minutes through 5,000 years of history. Rest now. The tablets are dry. The styluses are still. The classrooms are quiet. Sleep well.